Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for the latest of our second season of Dracula Lunchtime Bites. I know many of you have been to these before, but just in case this is your first time, the Lunchtime Bites series is organised by the Derby Dracula, and this is a project based in Derby that aims to celebrate Derby's links with Count Dracula because it was in Derby that in 1924 that the image of Count Dracula that we all know today was launched upon the world. This image of a suave aristocrat in evening dress. So enough of me. It's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Claire Mead. Now, by day, Claire is a museum professional and a curator and educator, and in her spare time, she's an independent scholar of Dracula and the Gothic from an LGBTQ perspective. Claire came to our conference in Derby in May and was one of the first to volunteer to give a talk at the second season of these Lunchtime Bites. So her presentation is entitled Queering the Slayer from Dracula to Buffy. So Claire, thank you for coming. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Duncan, and hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming and using your lunch times to find more about queering the Slayer. So first off, I did want to provide a bit of a quick overview about what we mean by queering, because it's not necessarily something that everybody is 100% familiar with. The fastest way of summarizing this is that this is one interpretation amongst many others of a piece of literature or media in a way that challenges established gender norms. So sometimes the text, when it comes to the original text, it's also maybe queer, or at least interpreted as such by many based on their work, life, and different pieces of evidence related to their life, as is the case for Dracula's author Bram Stoker for many. Sometimes this may be about direct references to queerness and queer identity within the text, but sometimes this queering comes from what can be suggested or observed from a different perspective, one that looks at different fears and desires around the idea of being queer and understands how this came through in a piece of work. So for me, it's not painting the text with a rainbow paintbrush, it's just looking at it through this rainbow lens. So it is probably fair to say, and many scholars have said lots of brilliant things about this, that Dracula and the archetype of the vampire has inspired a lot of queered interpretations. Of one side of this interpretation, the vampire can represent gender normative society's anxieties around queer figures, bringing along with it these different ideas of illness and infection via the vampire bite. It places ideas of transformation, sexual liberation, role reversal, and embracing in doing so different roles outside of the norm imposed by society, with the vampire both penetrating with its fangs and receiving vital fluids such as blood. In the original novel, the Count presents a direct threat first to solicitor and unwitting Transylvanian travel blogger Jonathan Harker, then to the rest of the on the surface heteronormative cast of characters, turning one of them, Lucy, into a monstrous and a sexual infant-killing creature before almost doing the same to one of the main women protagonists, Amina Harker. Amina, along with Jonathan, Lucy's once fiancé Arthur Holmwood, and Lucy's former suitors Dr. John Seward and Quincy Morris, helped by the expertise of Professor Van Helsing, help put an end to Dracula's vampiric takeover attempt and curse. With all this in mind, the Slayer feels on the surface like it should be the natural counterpart of the queered vampire, returning things to their natural, heterosexual, gender-normative order with a stake and some good old Victorian family values. But can the vampire slayer not only slay, but slay? Sorry, I just really wanted to do that. So the case for the queer slayer in Dracula, as in Dracula the original novel. The leading so-called heterosexual mortal men of Dracula are just as much at risk as women to Dracula's dangerous sense of queerness and otherness and being infected by it in different ways. Christoph Kraft in Kiss Me With Those Red Lips reflects on Harker's homoeroticism with the Count in their first encounter in his castle as being one where Harker is a direct object of desire and consumption. This only becomes more apparent when the Count's three vampiric brides overcome Harker and almost manage to subdue him into a passive role. Later on, Harker then has to look on helplessly as the Count attacks his fiancée become wife, Mina. As has been further pointed out in Preying on the Pervert by Diamond Clark, the idea of the vampire slayer maintaining a heterosexual status quo in Dracula can be dispelled by the open homosexuality throughout the novel shown by the men the Count encounters, as well as the closeness between Lucy and Mina. The very fact that Lucy herself has 3 suitors, yet all men remain friends after she chooses one of them, hints at the freedom of a possible potential in another world unconventional polyamorous relationship outside of a condemning, moralizing storyline that sees Lucy go from innocent ingenue to vampiric seductress. Their bond goes from spiritual to physical as their blood mingles during the numerous blood transfusions provided to Lucy. This is also represented by the iconic character of Professor Abraham von Helsing, who emerges as the older father figure of the group. His ability to dispense this emotional intelligence, vulnerability, and praise his fellow men throughout a novel with several good boy and brave boy words of praise throughout, and the fact his black clothing and leather bag have launched a whole visual mythos around the Slayer mean that allegations around him being the first leather daddy aren't entirely out of the realm of possibility. Outside of this, Helsing, like Dracula, is immediately steeped into a sense of otherness, indicated by his Dutch identity and his speech throughout the novel that reflects this. Most importantly, he encourages the rest of the group to remain in touch with their emotions, as I mentioned, including fear, grief, and compassion with the mortals that the vampires once were. All in all, repression of emotions to embrace an idealized masculine role isn't really, when you read, when you reread the original novel, seen as the best course of action, rather embracing sensitivity and strategy over outright immediate aggression. I feel this is further demonstrated by Helsing's knowledge and approach requiring preventative and protective measures before resorting to any aggressive ones. Ultimately, the polycule-like nature of the protagonist forming the Crew of Light, as named by Kraft, means challenging the idea of a one-on-one fight pitting a figure of good against a figure of evil. We do not have a set protagonist or even one coherent viewpoint due to the fragmented nature of the different bits of correspondence that piece the story of the novel together, and also imply that some parts and viewpoints have been left out of narrative, which in itself is this kind of queer form narrative. Rather than by brute force, the Count is defeated by observation, deep empathy with those who returned, and their elimination is seen as an emotional moment rather than a gleeful killing spree, as I wanted to show with this these bits of quotes from Van Helsing's final defeats of the brides. This is also translated into the weapons that the Crew of Light use and the way in which they go about using them. Shockingly, I'm not the first person to suggest a phallic-looking weapon may have some kind of relationship to masculinity. That being said, let's explore further. While stakes remain a means of vampire slaying that has remained the most popular tool by far in later adaptations, Dracula features a fair amount of daggers amongst its male counterparts. We have Johnson Harker's kukri knife, which is a Nepalese weapon that's primarily used by Nepali-speaking Gurkha soldiers within Nepal and some parts of northern India. And Stoker may have wanted to reference this knife and have Harker use it because of its connection to an old myth that it cannot be sheathed until it has drawn blood, which helps reinforce the up until now passive Johnson's resolve and masculinity. He's often described obsessively clutching the hilt in moments of helplessness, perhaps reflecting this, this frustrated sense of self that he's trying to reassert. And there's also no doubt a colonial and Orientalist reading to be had here about the Count, a foreign entity, being partly defeated by an equally foreign blade. Meanwhile, Quincy Morris's blade, Bowie knife, which would have been a brawling Texas man's weapon of choice, immediately helps characterize him and the type of more rugged masculinity he represents. But the choice of 2 daggers hardly feels like a random one. If the homoerotic vampire penetrates with a bite, the Slayer does so with a weapon, traditionally at close and intimate range. While the sword has always been associated with masculinity, the dagger has a far more complicated cultural gendered history, historically associated with femininity and a deceptive, ambiguous kind of fighting, back alley murder and trickery rather than the honorable sword duel. In a nutshell, if you were a man using A dagger, you would not necessarily seen as having a kind of very straightforward kind of approach to masculinity and honor and virtue associated with masculinity. But the way Harker and Morris do heroically defeat the Count together with their daggers subverts the traditional gender normative image of the male hero defeating the monster alone with a sword. Instead, we have a collective of men and a woman who know that they can only defeat this supernatural power by admitting their weaknesses and doing so alone, and joining forces. Over the years, there have been a massive amount of Dracula-inspired stories that have played with the archetype of the Slayer, often focusing on Professor Van Helsing rather than characters like Jonathan Harker or Quincy Morris. This will sometimes be a reinterpretation of Abraham himself or of one of his many, many, many descendants in these adaptations. They will usually simplify Van Helsing's role from a professor with a wide range of knowledge around many things, which just so happen to include killing vampires, to being entirely devoted to hunting vampires and other monsters. They will also make him the Count's arch nemesis, despite the fact that they barely have any singled out interaction in the novel itself, removing some of the queer collaborative power from the original novel. And while the stakes themselves, the actual stakes, are a staple of the genre, on-screen Slayer weapons will often substitute the subtle dagger for a more showy slaying tool. This is how we end up, for example, with the 2004 film Van Helsing, where Gabriel Van Helsing, played by Hugh Jackman, is portrayed as this rugged steampunk crossbow-toting leather-clad adventurer. Though the film's sympathy towards Frankenstein's monster, Helsing's own struggle with monstrosity as he's temporarily cursed to be a werewolf, and the bisexual awakening this film seems to have prompted amongst many early 2000s viewers, means there's maybe a bit more of a queer, nuanced reading to be had there. A lot of this is also directly expressed by just how camp the film is, with slaying as a showy performance rather than a careful process of trial and error and practicality. But Gabriel Van Helsing was obviously not the only modern slayer. By then, was a penchant for camp and the occasional crossbow. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, probably one of the most iconic modern reinventions of the Vampire Slayer. Dracula himself makes an appearance within the series in the episode Buffy vs. Dracula, as Buffy Summers confronts him, as do the brides that recreate the exact same scenario that they did with Jonathan Harker, with Sunnydale's favourite librarian and watcher, aka the all-knowing mentor of the Slayer, Rupert Giles. The only other overt references to the Dracula canon within the Buffyverse can be found in a short story in a Buffy book series, Tales of the Slayer, around the lore of Slayer's past within this wider universe. In it is revealed that the 19th century Slayer has as her watcher a certain Peter Van Helsing. This seems to confirm suspicions that the Watchers in particular are very Helsing-esque in their sources of inspiration. Watchers have the ability to fight and slay vampires, but do not have the inherent mythical strengths of the Slayer and are therefore relegated to being their mentors. Their power is drawn from esoteric knowledge, educating about fighting, and only taking part in action when necessary. In many ways, many of the original qualities of Dracula's Slayers and Van Helsing have been separated in a sense into two different archetypes between the action-oriented Slayer and a knowledge-imbued Watcher. And often this is done across gendered lines, with the Slayers always being women and the Watchers, usually with some exceptions, being male. Buffy Summers' usual heterosexuality might, the space throughout the series, might on the surface spell any queer reading, though her earlier relationship with fellow Slayer Faith does not provide many good heterosexual explanations and seems to play directly into the idea of Buffy finding more than just potential friendship with the only girl she's ever met who shares her exact experiences and struggles as a Slayer. Buffy inherently challenges gender expectations and embraces both the deadly practicality of the Slayer with a certain level of femme energy at all times, with high kicks and high heels becoming a camp staple of the series, but also helping dispel the trope of an action film, action style leading woman who cannot express her femininity or emotions. Despite an array of different weird and wonderful weapons, including at some point a rocket launcher, edge weapons and stakes remain Buffy's weapons of choice, reflecting the same desire to get up close, violent, and personal with the very monsters she has to fight. But much of the queer reading of Buffy Summers is darker rather than immediately prideful and femme-powering. In the struggle she experiences with the inherent nature of an identity she can do little to change. Buffy even gets a coming out moment with her own mother as she declares her own Slayer identity and gets asked, "Honey, are you sure you're a vampire slayer? I mean, have you tried not being a vampire slayer?" What could have remained a one-liner joke develops into a much more harrowing metaphor when Buffy expresses the loneliness she feels about her role and how she'd rather be gossiping about boys. A permanent sense of traditional, comfortable heterosexuality denied to her, regardless of her relationships throughout the series. After outing herself, Buffy is shortly after forced to leave home, like many young queer and trans people at the time of the release of the episode, and still today. Other pretty overt metaphors around Slayer pride and even conversion therapy are peppered throughout the series, but Buffy's sense of isolation linked to her identity is a constant here. This is only finally resolved with the fact that she no longer finds herself alone as a sole, once-in-a-generation Slayer, as our favourite lesbian witch Willow Rosenberg helps her activate the latent Slayer potential within girls worldwide in a queer feminist moment of collective power that is explicitly meant to topple the patriarchal status quo by changing and rewriting the rules. Giles, as the other kind of flip side to the traditional Slayer identity, provides more subtle insights into the queer Slayer readings outside of his many no heterosexual explanations for this moments with spikes throughout the series. Just like many bantering relationships hinting at queerness but never acting upon it between men in 90s and 2000s TV series, this is usually played off as comedy, though his relationship with Ethan Rayne is less easily played off and a lot more ambiguous. But like Buffy, the full queer potential lies beneath the surface. In many ways, Giles fulfills the role that Professor Van Helsing fulfills of both the metaphorical father figure and the outsider, this time as an Englishman amongst Americans, yet which also brings him closer to the dangerous old world Europe with the English and Irish vampires of the series. We know he has a troubled past and dabbled in demonology alongside some punk behavior that, again, does not escape bisexual allegations. While he's not assigned to a role in the same sense as Buffy, it is implied that being a Watcher is a family tradition and was not much of a choice. Clear parallels are also drawn between the forceful and rigid rules of the Watchers' Council and the gender-normative institution represented by a bastion of white, authoritative, cis-straight Englishmen in tweeds. Giles becomes a traitor to the status quo by choosing a more genuine relationship of trust and care with his Slayer, as well as a chosen family dynamic that is so important to many queer people who have to break down institutional barriers and choose their own communities. This finally leads us to an interesting parallel with a much more recent vampire show, which is What We Do in the Shadows. A follow-on from the original film, it follows the adventures of a chaotic vampire house share in New York. At the start of the series, it established that Nandor, the relentless human familiar Guillermo de la Cruz, is absolutely desperate to finally get turned into a vampire by him. This then becomes further complicated by the fact that it is revealed that Guillermo is a descendant of Van Helsing with incredible Buffy Summers-like natural slaying ability. Then we have Guillermo actually canonically coming out as gay. This recontextualizes him actively wanting to go against his family calling as a born slayer to become a vampire as an extension of his queer identity and experiences. When he becomes tired of waiting for Nandor to turn him and seeks out as a vampire, this is seen as a kind of betrayal, like to cheating within a relationship. And the transformation is not straightforward due to his Helsing blood, perhaps a metaphor for how deeply ingrained heteronormativity can prevent us from achieving our true queer selves. But ultimately, after making it as a vampire, Guillermo chooses to be turned back, not to embrace his inherited slayer nature or reject his life with Nandor and the rest of the vampires, but to accept being himself on purely human terms. Again, maybe something there about the way coming out and or transitioning can lead us to picture an ideal, unattainable standard that isn't necessarily what we need or ultimately feel comfortable in to be fully, truly ourselves as a queer and or trans person. So in conclusion, now we know how the slayer can potentially slay, but why should they? Myself, like many other queer people, have always embraced the darker, vilified side of queer representation, reclaiming it as a mark of defiant pride. To paraphrase Morticia Adams in the 1991 film, in doing so, we gladly feast on those who would subdue us. There is power in reclaimed monstrosity, And yet, reclaiming heroic tropes can be our own way of reimagining and reshaping our worlds in complex, nuanced ways, as opposed to ones where we are ever relegated to a few roles as punchlines, cautionary tales, or villains. The idea and importance of a queer vampire slayer for me is not the idea of an acceptability politics metaphor for being the good, queer, heroic person that slays the unpalatable, bad vampire queer. It is the radical acknowledgement that we sit in ambiguous and fluctuating roles, that we blur neatly established binaries and boundaries in doing so, and that it's not that we only ever bite away from becoming the monster that we're fighting, but that we're not that different from one another in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claire. That was fascinating. That's a perspective on Dracula and the Slayer that we don't often hear. We've got plenty of time for questions. So if you have any questions for Claire, either unmute and ask them or type them into chat and I'll read them out for you. So anybody got any questions for Claire?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
It was a really great talk, Claire, and I'm really familiar with the Buffy storylines, and yeah, definitely you raised some interesting points in relation to the queering of the Slayer in the Buffyverse. I just wondered, I know it's not quite vampiric, but I wondered if you'd ever had a look at the K-pop demon hunters, and particularly the character of Rumi, is it Rumi?
Yes.
And whether the same arguments might apply in that.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so happy you mentioned K-pop demon hunters, because it does definitely, it's again that great example of queering, because on the surface it's obviously not a film where you're going to have canonical queer relationships that are represented, although you might interpret them from some of the relationships that that some characters of the same gender have. But really the queering of it is through that monstrosity metaphor. We have Rumi who's struggling between her two identities, as you know, as sorry, minor K-pop demon hunter spoilers, but I'm not going to spoil the whole thing. Between being a K-pop demon hunter who's defeating demons, and then we realize, I think 5 minutes into the movie, that she actually is half demon through her father. And you then throughout the series get these really, really interesting dynamics of her trying to hide and almost kind of mask that identity, and also having the one motherly figure in her life telling her that she accepts her, but is going to help her hide these different parts of herself, which leads to this really poignant moment where Rumi is saying, I want you to love every single part of me. I think lots of people, really queer and trans people, really resonated with that scene. So did lots of people experiencing who are neurodiverse. I have ADHD, and we sometimes have this sense that we need to mask and we need to act in a certain way within society to be accepted, to be successful. And it's only by hiding these parts of us that we'll succeed. But as we see in K-pop demon hunters, Rumi trying to repress that only ends up making it worse, and things will only resolve when she's truly able to accept all parts of herself. So absolutely, and I think it's a really great example of a kind of modernized take on the kind of the demon and the monster, and how the person slaying those monsters is never too far from them in terms of identity and becoming like them.
Absolutely. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Oh yes, please do watch Buffy. Brilliant autumnal rewatch. It's fantastic.
I have to confess, I haven't seen Buffy either. Yeah, we got a question from Simon. Is that you,
Hello,
Simon?
everybody.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Claire, I remember watching Buffy avidly when it came out. I was probably late 20s, early 30s, and we excitedly watched every episode. And I think it reached a broad audience because of lots of its postmodern traits and its intertextuality. And I remember at the time taking immense pleasures from that and recognizing some of the in-joke writing that was going on. And I'm conscious that the series was then rediscovered a couple of summers ago by my youngest daughter at 15 who avidly watched every, and we were able to have a father and daughter conversation about reading Buffy. And it did strike me that there were generational readings of Buffy that I think are quite interesting, not least when it comes to queer reading Buffy. Would you agree that there are generational readings of the text?
Yeah, I find that really interesting, especially when you again look at the character of Buffy and Giles. I think when you're a younger person, you're obviously going to fully. I mean, it's really serious where the vampire slaying it was originally really openly being seen as that kind of teenage struggle that Buffy is going through, and the angst and some things that really haven't aged as well, have they, with a relationship with Angel and different things, but do provide that very raw and quite dark dark depiction of teenage angst and grief at some point, which in an episode, The Body, which is probably one of the most poignant episodes of television I've ever watched, which I won't spoiler for people who haven't watched it yet. But I think now, weirdly enough, I relate a lot more to the character of Giles in terms of educating, trying to kind of keep track of what's happened in the past in terms of queer history, and trying to impart that and upon younger queer people in terms of what does our community need, how can we continue to foster community, even sometimes will be a little bit chaotic and we won't necessarily know what we're doing. And I'm sure that feeling will only continue to increase in the future, that sense of of being confronted with young people who are faced with just the unfairness of the world we live in, and trying to find a way to guide them through it in different ways. So I think there definitely are lots of these intergenerational readings and conversation starters that you can have with Buffy, as well as conversation starters that are important to have around Joss Whedon, and the fact that the separation between author and content, because obviously Buffy is a series that has provided this incredible representation and joy for so many people, but we're now aware of the way in which the cast were treated by Whedon and the different kind of issues around that. So I think it can lead to some really, really interesting conversations, not in terms of the content itself, but also the whole context around it.
Thank you.
We've got time for one more question if anybody has one. Nobody seems to be unmuting. Okay, well, it's 2 minutes to 1, so that's the perfect time to finish. Thank you very much, Claire. I think you've inspired quite a few people to Buffy, which, if nothing else, is an achievement. So on behalf of everybody here, can we all say thank you to Claire? So either unmute and shout out thank you, or use the react icon, or just turn on your screen and clap. So thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for slaying by making it during the lunchtime.